Welcome to Don Johnston Webinars. I'm Joan McAlpin, and I'll be your host for the next 45 minutes. So we're here today to talk about what works for dyslexia, and what better way than to have a conversation with people who live, learn, and very definitely succeed with dyslexia. I am so honored to welcome to our microphone Don Johnston. He's our founder and CEO of Don Johnston Incorporated. And he really is the visionary behind all of our accessible technologies. So Co-Writer, which is our premium word prediction program, Snap and Read, which is our read aloud tool. And we're going to be hearing from Patara about how she has used both of those tools. But Don's been the visionary behind this company and all of our tools and curriculum. And he's the author of the book Building Wings, which if you have students who struggle with reading, I would highly recommend you go to our website and check out that book, because it's just a terrific read for students, very encouraging. I'd also like to welcome our special guest, Patara Japay. I met Patara a couple of years ago when she came out to Chicago, and we are very happy to have her back. For those of you who have not met her yet, Patara recently graduated magna cum laude with a Juris Doctor from Syracuse University Law School. Before that, Patara attended Syracuse University, where she earned both a master's degree in Cultural Foundations of Education, as well as a CAS in Disability Studies. Before that, Patara served as Chief of Staff for New York State Assemblywoman Joanne Simon. And before that, she's even served as the program director for Everyone Reading. And I just want to back up a little bit further and say before that, Patara was told she would probably never graduate from high school because of her extreme dyslexia. And we are now here to share her story about how she recently passed the New York State Bar exam. Congratulations, Patara.
Thank you so much.
Don, would you please tell us a little bit, set the stage for us about why we're having this conversation with Patara?
Yeah, well, welcome everybody, and I'm kind of a little relieved that I don't have to show my face on camera, since I kind of look like George Washington doing this, not having had a haircut for about 4 months, and so, but I first met Patara about 4 years ago. We had lunch, and she was going off to law school, and he was going there with a couple of our products, and which you'll hear more about. And we just connected. I kind of feel that Patara and I are like soulmates, and or war buddies. You know, we've been through a lot together. We know what it's like to live with dyslexia, and even though our journeys have been different, we kind of know each other's journey, and we know what we've been through. And I'm just so proud of her, and I'm just so excited for her, because she's going to make a difference for people with learning struggles, you know, through law. You know, my attempt has been through products, and her is going to be through law. And I just want to say something for both of us. This is just not a job, this is personal, and we are determined to, you know, have an impact. And just knowing her and being with her, and the commonality that we have of wanting to make a difference. Recently, and Joan will give you the web link for this, we have a free site for content, and right now we have about 35 articles on it. And Patara just recently wrote a 3-part series on her life and her experience of going up, you know, discovering her disability, discovering her, and we both don't like that word disability, discovering her learning struggles, and going up through law school and passing the New York Bar exam. And that's on snapexplorer.com. And you'll see it under the people column, where every article right now is about somebody that had some struggle that they had to overcome. And it's really intended for individuals who have some kind of struggle. So I welcome with that. So Patara, welcome, and I'm just so excited to be doing this webinar with you. Patara, well, welcome and thank you for being here, and thank you for all that you've done and all will do. I wanted to start with, when did you first discover you had a problem with reading?
First, thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor, and I can't express how wonderful it was to have met someone who can understand some of the struggles that I've encountered. I remember the first time someone asked me, when can I remember that I couldn't read or was a struggling reader? And I had to really think about it. And I think for me, my earliest memory, as I share in my story, that's now up online, was in preschool. For me, it was really early on in that I was bright. I thought I was bright. I had parents who read to me and who really valued education. And so in preschool, I was in the advanced class, so to speak. I was sectioned with the kindergarteners who were beginning to read and sound out sounds. And I remember sitting with my preschool teacher in a circle, almost like a round robin style of sounding out and repeat after me. And as advanced as I was in other areas in my vocabulary, in my speech, I was not able to sound it out. The words, even though we were sounding them out together, I had no idea when it came time to then repeat the word. And I remember her chastising me and telling me that like I wasn't working hard enough and I was being lazy and not playing around. And I was in tears, right? Like I felt like I wasn't doing anything wrong. I don't understand what you want me to do. And that's really my first memory of it. I know my parents could sense that there were some things wrong. I think at the time there was this notion that in time things would just click, right? And that it would click for me and I get it. And along the way, I had educators by the first grade who said, I think there's something wrong with her visually. And my mother, as an educator, was like, oh, okay, awesome. We'll go get her glasses this weekend. It's no problem. And the teacher said, I don't think it's glasses, right? So they weren't able to piece together that it was dyslexia, but I knew. I mean, I couldn't read anything. I couldn't spell anything. I could barely get my own name correctly in terms of spelling. So, but I would think that my earliest memory for myself was preschool.
Yeah.
Katara, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a couple of comments that your voice is cutting in and out a little bit. You might want to just make sure that your microphone is steady and in one place and that the volume's turned up. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'll let you continue. Thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for me, I discovered that I had a problem in first grade where the other kids were picking up, this was back in the 1950s. I hate to, and we didn't even know what dyslexia was. People or the educators did not know what dyslexia was. At least certainly mine didn't. And when all the other kids were reading the Dick and Jane novels, I just didn't get it. I couldn't see those words. I couldn't make those words, what I was seeing, into words that made sense. And about halfway, and I've talked about this in my book, about halfway through, the teacher made two of us in the class go back to the beginning of the reading section on Dick and Jane and start all over again. And I just remember the humiliation and the embarrassment. And that embarrassment has stayed with me a long time. In fact, I didn't start talking about my dyslexia until probably about 20 years ago. it was a deep, dark secret. My next question, Pitar, is, did your teachers understand what was going on with you early on?
I would say no. I was fortunate to have a mom, as I mentioned before, who was an educator, who taught every grade except for middle school, but from preschool to high school outreach. She retired as a literacy coach. I had a grandmother who went back later in life and got her master's and actually taught special ed. I went to schools outside of my district. I'm from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York. Fairly good public schools here in the city of New York. But no one was trained on the identification of dyslexia or what to do if a child was even diagnosed with reading difficulties. And so I had educators who could sense something was wrong. My abilities didn't compute. You know, this is a student who could verbatim memorize stories and read them back. In fact, my father, who's not an educator, worked as a high-level administrator in the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, would take me to Barnes & Noble every single day, or every single Saturday, I apologize. And we would get the Bernstein Bear books. I loved the series. And I had this clever way of picking out all the new books, putting the book I hadn't read at the bottom. And so when he would read through the stories and ask me to identify the letters and the sounds and the words, I would essentially have memorized it from when he used to read it at home, or it was read to me at home. And so he had very little sense that I wasn't decoding at all. My teachers knew the student who couldn't read at all, right? And so even though people say, you know, you were diagnosed really young, I was diagnosed in the 3rd grade, this was a very cut and dry case of a kid who I entered the 7th grade not reading at all, really. And by the end of the 7th grade, being able to identify some words that a 2nd grader could read. So my teachers were aware that there was a problem, quote unquote. They had no idea, okay, so then what does that mean, right? My 3rd grade teacher was the one that said, we have to get her evaluated. She was scheduled to teach the 4th grade class. And so she said, I'm going to have her again, and I need to know how to teach the student. And that's when I was evaluated. But even then, after that, I switched schools every year. I switched educational environments. I did everything from response to intervention services to then being evaluated and being in a self-contained class to an inclusion class, a collaborative team teaching environment. Back into special ed, a self-contained, resource room, all of it. I had OT, I had PT, I did everything short of standing on my head. I got services outside of school, but nothing seemed to be working. It was a lot of whole language stuff, not a lot of multisensory education. Definitely wasn't exposed to assistive technology. So my teachers, I think, for the most part, because a lot of them, I was fortunate to have a lot of great educators, they tried, but they didn't quite know how to help.
Yeah, that kind of leads into my next question, is really about, I felt for me, all my teachers were trying to fix me. And I think, and I don't know whether you could see this quote, Pitar, on the screen. It's really about, you know, we have dyslexia, and it you know, it's part of us, and it's not something that necessarily can be fixed. I mean, we can certainly compensate, but I always feel like I'm just not, my dyslexia is really not fixable. It could, you know, we could move in that direction. You know, I'm a good reader now, but I would never dare read this quote out loud because I would get all the letters mixed up, all the words mixed up. But you know, there's this question out in the field about what's fixable and what do we need to provide accommodations for, which is, you know, the assistive technology that you've been using.
Yeah, I am a huge component of both. I advocate both. I think there's been a long history of these unsaid um, battle between, the reading specialists or the literacy coaches and the AT people. And for me, without both, I don't think I could do what I'm doing now. And so for me, I don't think that I thought can I be fixed? But there was this sense of I'm changing environments every year, right? So clearly there's something wrong. But I think, Don, you and I spoke last week, and the slight difference of, I think, our environments we grew up and how fortunate I was to have parents that really instilled, no, this is not a you problem. It's the world's problem, right? So in my head, I thought about it. I was a little kid who was like, oh, the school's not right. This
Yeah,
school,
yeah,
this classroom, this environment, it's not right for me, right? And that was very fortunate because I get to talk to parents and students who feel like they're the problem, they're dumb, they're stupid. But for me, and maybe that's because I did bounce around. My parents were like, okay, this didn't work. Where are we going next year, right? So for me, I began to build this mentality of, well, it's the teachers that can't figure it out, or it's the school environment that isn't right for me.
yeah,
I can go to different schools, I can see the difference. But there was this I guess, unsaid thing that the reason why I was transferring all the time and working with specialists is because I needed to learn how to read, right? Like that was something that needs to happen. And if taught right, then maybe I can get it. Maybe it'll click. Um, but I think it was, I would say, maybe in high school when I realized that this is where I'm at, right? Like,
yeah,
I worked with some of the best specialists in the country, and I did multisensory education, and I had intense enrichment. And I think that, there is so much value in that, right? Like, I appreciate the fact that I can read an exit sign, that I can, I can read basic words that help me navigate the world. But now at the age of 30, I was reevaluated for the bar, a full neuropsych, and I can identify without accommodations, some words that a fourth grader can. My reading is in the 0.1 percentile. you know,
yeah, yeah,
so if I were to solely rely on this idea that one day it'll click, one day with enough multisensory education, I too would be able to read, then I would still be in the fourth grade, right? Like, so assistive technology allowed me to bridge that gap. And so for me, it wasn't so much like, well, how could we fix me? But this is it. This is what dyslexia is, and I've made tremendous improvements. I can see that in myself, and I'm thankful for that. But I never had this mentality that I was the broken one. And
yeah.
so, that
And that's real different
I
than me. I
know it's not
always felt
common.
that I was the
Right.
broken
Yeah.
one.
Right. And I had friends who were taught that. I had friends who were embarrassed about having some form of disability. They didn't quite know. Their parents were embarrassed. They didn't tell them. They didn't understand it. But because I was brought up differently, I was able to say, hey, let's talk about this. And I think it really makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what was middle school like for you with your peers in having a learning issue?
Well, as I mentioned, I bounced around a lot. So every year was a different school and a different set of friends. Um, I finally was able to settle somewhere, right, when I was enrolled in the Churchill School in the 7th grade. So a lot of my middle school years were spent at the Churchill School, 7th and 8th grade. But prior to that, I had bounced around a lot. And I think for me, I'm very outgoing. I love to talk. I think that is the sense that was heightened because I couldn't read, right? The only way
Yeah.
I can navigate the world is through speaking. And so I did, and part of that was making friends. I was very social, but I did make friends with the tough kids, with the quote unquote bad kids. So no one messed with me in terms of that, in terms of picking on me. My dad would say, how are you friends with the child that's 6 feet tall and I'm 5 feet? I'm a little, I'm little. But so in that sense, I was able to, I think, design my social identity in a way that I wouldn't be picked on as much. I mean, of course, I heard things about special ed, and I rode, the quote unquote short bus and all of that. So I got that, but no one would mess with me in terms of picking on me or fighting with me or so on. And because I was social, I would then have friends that were also in general ed that I get to talk to and see in the hall, which many of the special ed kids did not. And then I was also friends when I was in different environments, especially in collaborative team teaching, with the students who were previous to that environment being in gifted and talented classes and who could read and spell way above grade level. And I somehow positioned myself to sit next to them in classes and ask them, how do I spell? How do I whatever? So there was a sense of, this social normality that I think most students don't have. But I switched schools every year. So by the time I got to Churchill School, it was the first time that I was surrounded by other students that had language-based learning disabilities, and a true program that attempted to teach us material on our grade level. And I think that was the first time that I was just a student. Right? I wasn't a student with a disability. I was just a student in that environment and was able to thrive there, and got to have all of the normal experiences of the horrific parts of being a smelly, loud, know-it-all teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And I was, probably at the other end. You learned how to adapt, and I was more of a victim. I was bullied. I was made fun of because I didn't know certain things. People would say words, and then if I didn't know what they meant, they would laugh at me. Uh, that's something that was very embarrassing throughout most of my life. And but I think a lot of kids, I get a lot of letters from kids, and I think we need to understand that and they need to learn, how to adapt to that. It was pretty clear when I was being bullied that it bothered me, and
Right.
that's like the worst thing in the world. Um, it's so you learned how to adapt to that, and your social skills were really helpful in that, and your self-confidence. I think that so much of this learning is about self-confidence. Don't you agree?
I agree. I think, and for me, I was fortunate. My parents put me in, I really excelled in dance. That was my world. That was my place. But finding things that kids are good at. So I knew, okay, well, I'm good at something. I can't be all stupid, quote unquote, right? Like, I'm good at something. So that was one, I think, that I had in my pocket. But then also thinking about, I hear oftentimes, a lot of times from educators or advocates for inclusion, and one of the things they'll say is, so the student doesn't feel bullied or doesn't feel, isolated. Well, I think it also, the narrative can be flipped, right? In that students who do not have disabilities and learning challenges also need to be educated about what they are and what is tolerated in our school environment, in our school family.
Yeah.
Because as children, the idea is that, well, to make them feel included, that one day they'll go out and get a job and their employer or whatever. But like flipping the script, what happens when I am your boss, right? How do or I go into the pharmacy or I go into the coffee shop. I am dyslexic, and we need to have environments where everybody is aware of what's going on in the classroom, not necessarily what students have what, right? Like, that's not what I'm saying. But I think that narrative also changes, begins to change dynamics too.
Yeah. Was
And I
there
was a city kid, right? Like, I was
yeah,
witty,
yeah, yeah,
not, I had to be savvy, and so I think that played a role in it too.
yeah. Can you identify a turning point where you started to feel confident that you could be a learner?
I think that's a tough question. So I think there were moments, there were glimpses throughout my educational journey. I definitely think being introduced to what I would call my first introduction to assistive technology, which is books on audio tape, that opened the world for me, because now I was able to read stories on my intellectual level rather than my decoding level. So that was definitely one. I think high school, right, being able to be a normal high school student and graduate, right, because I went to the school for children with language-based learning disabilities. I think another big one that stood out for me was my first semester in undergrad, where I made the dean's list and had a 4.0. I think that was a big light bulb. Because
Wow.
I was part of a learning disability program at Adelphi University, but it was a mainstream liberal arts college. And that was a light bulb moment for me that I can do this, and with the right accommodations, I could really do this. But I think I would have to say that turning point for me is now. I look back at the journey and having to have counsel and to advocate and to deny my rights to access the classroom or the LSAT or my horrible experience with the bar. And it still doesn't feel real. I still feel like I have to pinch myself. I think the moments that I saw the results that I had passed the bar is when the light bulb clicked for me that I did what many said were the impossible, and that now the work begins. Now I get to have a normal life and advocate and do all these things I wanted to do. There was still, I never really recognized it, or it wasn't in the forefront of my brain. But there was this little part inside of me that was like, can you really do this? The world says you haven't. So many people said that I couldn't. Barriers were put up. I was denied things. And it's in this moment, I think, maybe it's because it's during COVID-19 and I have some time to think about it. But I think when I look back, this will be my turning point moment.
Yeah. And that building that confidence that you can do it, you can succeed is a real, it's a real critical thing. For me, when I was in 8th grade, I had a teacher, most teachers had given up on me. And I had a teacher with just the most demanding teacher. And at the same time, she was very supportive. But she was clearly, failure is not an option. And and she was bound and determined to make me a learner. And it created a cognitive dissonance because I kept wondering what she saw in me. And it got me trying to learn again. And I became a learner. I say I became a learner in 8th grade, but I didn't learn to read until I was in 9th grade. In 9th grade, I read my first book, and but it took a certain level of confidence that I could be a learner, and that learning can turn into me being a reader. And I think that's just a real critical thing.
Yeah, and that is the key. I think, like, I can't put into words. I think for me, my first, I think what I give credit to the most is the fact that the educators that I had made sure I learned. And I can't express enough how many educators I speak to that don't allow their students to access curriculum. true rich curriculum. If
Yeah.
if I had to sit and read Hop on Pop and Sound Out and Jane and Jim and whatever, those stories, I would still be sitting there, right? Like, I had educators who said, okay, you know, one of the basic accommodations I ever got was waiving my spelling. You
Yeah.
have to do this homework assignment like everybody else. I don't care if your spelling is incorrect, but what you put down there, you know, who's the main character? What did they do? How did they get there? What was, you know, the protagonist's name? But all these different things, you know, where was your period? Your sentence should start with a capital. So for me, I was able to still participate in the core curriculum, whereas I have parents who say to me, well, my child is dyslexic, so they're doing poorly in math and reading and science. And I'm thinking, well, those things aren't mutually exclusive. They may not know how to read or decode or encode, but they still should be able to understand what's going on in history, what's happening here, where's the breakdown, right? And so your comment about learning to be a learner is crucial, right?
Yeah.
You could be a non-reader and still be a learner. And I think that is, you know, very important.
Yeah, and it's I think a lot of what happens in schools is we judge a person's ability to read based upon their ability to read. We base upon their ability to learn based upon what they
Right.
can do. And
Right. And that's simply not true.
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. When did you first discover assistive technology? And I, I know we talked 4 years ago when we had lunch in New York, and I think you were just getting started with Co-Write and Write Out Loud.
Yep. Yeah.
Was it Snap and Read back then? I can't remember.
It was Snap and Read first. So for me, as I
Gotcha.
mentioned, I would say my first introduction is, you know, the good old audiobooks, right? As I moved through school, I didn't really have a lot of assistive technology. Technology wasn't in the place then that really worked for me. I tried Dragon, which at the time required you to read these huge passages in so it could recognize your voice, which I simply couldn't do. There were a lot of programs I tried and they just didn't work, right, for me at the time. And so I was a student who continued to use text-to-speech in some type of recording, but I had to rely heavily on people to spell check, people to read, because a lot of stuff wasn't in an accessible format. It didn't come in audio, especially in college. And then once I graduated, realizing, you know, I was a young professional and I also aspired to go to law school, I began to think about, okay, what tools will allow me to do this, right? Like, this is like tackling almost the impossible. What can I do? And I remember going to a conference and Ruth from Don Johnson was there and she gave this presentation and it clicked. It clicked for me and I was like, this could work. This could really work, right?
Yeah.
I was intrigued with Co-Writer. I was intrigued with Snap and Read. And I thought, oh, wow, this could really, you know, change the game for me, in that it would be seamless. I could use it everywhere. And so I reached out to figure out, okay, how could I get this? How does this work? And that's when I started using Snap and Read and Co-Writer, got them together, and definitely started using Snap and Read first because I was more familiar with text-to-speech than speech-to-text. And I use it now in my everyday life all the time. I use it all throughout law school, and will continue to use it. I use definitely a number of assistive technology tools. I like to say that I created a true AT toolkit that works well for me. Oftentimes I hear from, you know, family members or educators and they're like, well, Batara, what do you use? And it'll be like a magic pill. And the truth is there's a whole bunch of stuff in my toolkit. I like to say if you have a pencil case, you most likely find a pencil, but you'd also have a pen and a highlighter and probably some whiteout, right? They all do the same thing, right? And that they all mark up your paper, but they're all different. And so for me, Co-Writer and Snap and Read, they're a must-have in my toolkit, and they're something I use every day, both in my personal life and professional life.
Yeah, could you give an example of how you would use those products in law school? Just
Yeah.
want to.
So for me, for an example, Snap and Read, right? So definitely for reading my textbooks, I would get them in digital format from the publisher. And then I was able to read my textbooks. But most recently, the legal writing. So I would do legal writing and research, and I would use the outlining tool for Snap and Read to highlight quotes and sections, and then be able to go back to that and build all of my writing assignments that way. I had them sectioned, LCR 1, LCR 2, LCR 3 in my outline. I used Co-Writer. One of my first memories was using Co-Writer to write a thank you letter for a scholarship that I had received for law school. And I asked my boyfriend to spell check it, as I often ended up having to do, because spell check couldn't pick up on a lot of my words. And he looked at me like with tears in his eyes, and it was like, we've been together now 12 years. So he was there in undergrad. He was there in high school, towards the end of high school. And he was my scribe for all of undergrad. He was my reader, right? We didn't even go to the same school, but he made it happen. And so he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and he's like, this is the first time that I have spell checked your work and there are no spelling mistakes. That was the moment for both of us where I was like, oh, I think I can do this.
Absolutely.
So yes, those are the moments that stand out to me.
Great. Joan, can you advance the next slide?
Certainly.
I just think it's I think I said this in my book, Building Wings. I feel sorry for entrepreneurs who are not dyslexic. They don't know how to deal with failure. Could you make a comment on that, Pitara?
Yeah, I get it. And I agree. I think that, in order to have dyslexia, whether quote unquote successful or not, you have to be someone who works hard, someone who's tenacious, someone who thinks outside of the box. I think of the student who, just to go to school every day from 8 in the morning to 3 and do something that you are inherently not good at, your brain is not wired that way, and to do it for hours on end, to then come home and do homework that you probably didn't understand in class or couldn't read in class. Forget all the other interventions outside of school and during school and pull out and push in that student does, and they show up, every day or more days than not. That student is a hard worker, and I don't think we think of it that way, but they are. There are plenty of times where I broke down. We have to work twice as hard as our peers, period, whether it seems like we're doing it or not, to accomplish the same task. And once we are doing that task, once we are in that space, we have to think outside of the box. We have to figure out ways in which we are going to navigate and compensate with our disability. And I think it spills into other areas. It's the way in which we think about situations, right? Yep. A lot of us build interpersonal skills. So I think that quote speaks to me very strongly, because it becomes a gift. It becomes your special weapon, I think.
Yeah, Sally Shaywitz talks about, she did brain research. She's from Yale, and she did brain scan research, MRIs on dyslexic readers and non-dyslexic readers, and she found that non-dyslexic normal readers, let's call it, read at the back part of their brain, and dyslexic
Mm-hmm.
readers read in the front part of their brain. And that happens to be the strategic brain center. And so for me, you know, I have to read strategically. I have to think strategically. And I think that leads to people who are business leaders. Like there's a disproportion in Malcolm Gladwell's book. He talks about the disproportionate number of people that lead technology companies, and it's
Right.
like double the population. It's like 30%
Wow.
of all the people. I think it was 20% or 30% of all the people that lead technology companies have dyslexia, and
Yeah.
I think it's
And we're
interesting
also just
because
not
it's a
strangers
different
to
area of the brain.
failure.
What's that?
I said, yeah, and we're just also not strangers to failure,
Yeah.
right? Like, to doors being shut and saying no, right? Like, I was denying my right to take the LSAT. Felt like a failure to me. I tried
Yeah.
different law schools, felt like a failure to me. I literally failed a lot in school growing up, F and D's and C's. And that sense of failure was very real. And the fact that, you know, you kept going, right? So I would assume when you fail in business, quote unquote, or fail in life, it doesn't become something that stops you.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, how do you turn, you know, it's the old, how do you turn lemonade, you know, lemons into lemonade? And,
That's right.
you know, you just, yeah, and I think there's a lot of documents saying that people who fail and are able to turn around their failures are more successful.
Yeah.
Joan, I'm thinking this might be a good time to move to questions from our audience.
Definitely. Thank you. This has been so fascinating to listen to, and we do have a lot of questions. So I just want to remind folks that because, you know, we're starting to come up on our time limit here, if we don't answer your question directly today, we'll make sure to follow up with you offline. I'll share the questions with Don and with Patara, and we'll make sure to follow up with everyone. So first of all, you know, I think one of the ways to encapsulate the most common question here is, so what would you recommend for students or for educators who are working with students with dyslexia? What worked best for you, Patara, when it comes to specific kinds of accommodations?
Wow, that's a big question. I think, you know, one of the things that I think was crucial was starting them as early as possible. So I hear a lot from educators, oh, they're afraid to introduce assistive technology because they feel like the child will, you know, learn how to read and they'll rely on it. You know, that's a huge myth, right? It's much easier to do the things that you're able to do. I liken it to, you know, if you break your legs and you're on crutches, you know, the person's using the crutches, and the minute they can't, you know, they can move somewhat, they're hobbling across the room to get their, you know, glass of water, right? Like, and so the same thing too when it comes to reading. If this is something your brain can do, it's much easier to do it than to use assistive technology or any other, you know, accommodation or tool. But to introduce it as early as possible, so begin to play with it, right? Like, not every tool is going to work for every student. They may not like it, and that's okay. But don't just, you know, discard the idea altogether, which is oftentimes what I see. People get frustrated, and rightfully so. I think that using my accommodations and my assistive technology took years to master. And I don't say that lightly. You know, I think when we think about giving a child extra time, right? When you're in elementary school and the test is 15 minutes, no problem. Even when you're in high school, the test is an hour, it's 2 hours. Well, I took the bar and it was 8.5 hours each day for 4 consecutive days. The stamina it took to do that was years in the making, right? The same thing with my assistive technology. I, you know, listen to my text-to-speech at about 300 words per minute, which sounds like, to the layperson, a bunch of like chipmunks, right? Because the average person, you know, speaks only at about 110 to 150 words per minute. So that skill that I have acquired in order to cut down time so that it only takes me time and a half to do a task and not 3 times as long as the classmate sitting next to me was invaluable. I also think that, you know, when you have a student, you often see them for a snapshot of time, for the year that they're in your class, you know, for that amount of time, but that this is going to be an individual who grows up and has to navigate the world. And I hear people say, well, you know, he or she isn't going to college. That's fine. They may or may not do that. But I am dyslexic when I brush my teeth in the morning with toothpaste that I cannot spell, you know, the label of, the title of, when I go to the doctor, when I go to the supermarket, when I go to the coffee shop. And using assistive technology, learning how to advocate for myself is a tool that I carry with me everywhere in the world. So I would say to, you know, start and start with one thing, one product. Let it build. That's okay. Some of the biggest accommodations, just to name them if that's helpful, that I still have today. As I mentioned, waiving spelling is huge. Allow the child, the student to write, to just write, to learn how to be a writer, to take in information. I use text to speech. I use speech to text. I have double time. I have a reader and scribe for all of my exams, including the bar. I have double time. I have separate location. In law school, it was the accommodation of waiving the requirement that I read out loud in class. There's so many accommodations, and I tell people to start with the task you're trying to achieve, not the disability, you know, not that's helpful, but start with the task you're trying to achieve. How I use Snap and Read in my personal life and my professional life is slightly different based on the task that I'm trying to achieve. So start there and work your way out from that ripple. You know, they're having difficulty taking notes in class. They're having difficulty with physically reading the material. Maybe it's processing the material. You might end up at the same product at the end, but how you use it and why you're using it will make a difference.
Excellent. Thank you.
I know that was long-winded, but
no, but I think you spoke to many of the questions that are here. For instance, we have a great number of speech language pathologists and occupational therapists that are attending the session today. And their biggest thing is, okay, if there's one thing that you would recommend for us as practitioners, Katara, that we could start doing with our dyslexic students tomorrow, you know, what would that one thing be? So I think you spoke to several of those things, but the ideas of like waiving spelling requirements and just getting your students writing, that sounds like a great place for folks to start.
Yeah.
Here's another question. How did you manage taking a foreign language requirement in school? Were you ever required to take a foreign language?
So I was exempt from taking a foreign language. Based my IEP, that was one of the requirements that was waived for me. So I didn't take a foreign language. I am an avid traveler. I've been to a lot of countries, and I still cannot pick up a language. My goal is to have 5 words in each country and try to stick to it while I'm there. But it's still very difficult for me. You know, if you're dyslexic in English, you're dyslexic in every language. And so learning a second language or a foreign language was very difficult. And in college, I was fortunate to go to a school that did not require a language requirement. So that's how I got around that. But I would have filed for accommodation. So
yeah. For me, I took Spanish in high school, and it was just very painful, and I just didn't get it. And when I went to college, I would have had to start in year 3 of a language, and so I started over again because I needed 2 years in college, and so I took French. It was just real painful, and fortunately I had a teacher that understood, and they started a reading track where you didn't have to speak it, because I just don't have I can't hear the other sounds. And so but I can read in a different language. I've been to
Oh,
several
wow.
countries. I've been to several countries. When I'm in that country, it's amazing what I pick up. And I know there's several times I've been to Spanish-speaking countries, and I'm talking basic Spanish to people, and the same way with French.
Right.
But it's a real hard thing to learn in the way that we do it without an immersion experience for me.
Right. I mean, I had in elementary school, I was taught Spanish or, what Spanish class or whatever. And it was the same thing. It was very painful. And not just not understanding the sounds, but understanding like how the sounds worked and why the words worked that way and why there's feminine and masculine. And like the whole thing just didn't work for me. And even traveling abroad, I could be in that country, for weeks and months. And I don't, I don't know what it is. I don't know. I can't. The sounds, the way the words work, the sentence structures, and a lot of times it's taught with, I think I would do better in a program that was conversational. A lot of foreign languages, you're taught the verbs and the nouns and the sentence structure, and all of that is way too confusing for me, so.
No.
Okay. We have way more questions. I think these are the most questions I've seen in one of our sessions in quite a while. I'm going to take one more, and then again, we're going to follow up with you. You're going to receive an email in the next 24 to 48 hours that includes a copy of the recording along with the slides and a certificate of attendance, and we'll follow up with each question individually. But like the speech language therapists who are online, we've got a lot of occupational therapists, and one of them says, Patara, you mentioned that you had occupational therapy. What was the most valuable thing an OT did to help you with? Like, what would you suggest? Do you have any particular remembrance of occupational therapy that was particularly effective?
Unfortunately, I don't. My best friend is a recent OT. And for me, I think I was a student that didn't necessarily need to have OT services at the time. I think that it was where the district is going to try everything. Now, I think it would have been helpful to work on, assistive technology and things like that. But unfortunately, I don't have any memories of working with an OT in a way that remotely addressed my dyslexia.
Okay, well, what I'll do in the case of answering that question is that I'm going to share through the chat panel now a link to a page that we have on our website where we specifically share resources and address issues around dyslexia and dysgraphia. And so you can look at some information there. I just shared the page with you guys through chat, and I'll include that in the follow-up email. And so we have addressed that issue for OTs, SLPs, AT specialists. So you can take a look at some of those resources there. Unfortunately, we've run way over time. I'm sorry we didn't get to every question, but once again, we're going to answer those for you. We'll follow up with you offline. And so now I want to be sure to thank everyone that's been here today. You've taken a good hour or more out of your time to join us today, and we really appreciate your dedication to helping students. Don, would you like to say some final words for us?
I'm just really thankful that we have so many people online this morning, and keep in mind that we will respond to your questions, and I know we have a lot of parents and a lot of students online, and for you too, we'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have. And I just want to add that you can follow up with Patara's story. It's considerate text. It's written at a considerate level. And it's like a graphic novel. Her story reads like a graphic novel, and that's snapexplorer.com, and it's under the People tab.
Don, I put this up on the screen real
Okay.
fast, just so people can see it, snapexplorer.com. And here we have this amazing story about Patara.
Yep.
So I'll share that out with everybody in their email. Okay, you guys, it's been an hour. We're over time. Thank you so much. And thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.